A string of racist incidents at high-profile football matches has left players and fans wondering how to tackle behaviour many thought was in the sport's past. I'm Femi Oke.
I'm Malika Bilal. Can racism be kicked out of football? Join today's conversation through Twitter and YouTube.
Monkey chants from spectators, racial abuse from other players, and even assaults near the training ground. The abuse faced by ethnic and religious minorities in football has left clubs and governing bodies scrambling to find effective ways to combat it.
In late March, Black England international players faced racist chanting from fans of opposing side, Montenegro, in a Euro 2020 qualifier. The European governing body is investigating.
Racism is not just confined to one league or one country. 3 Juventus players, including goalscorer Mosiah Kayon, were subject to racist abuse from opposing fans throughout a match earlier this month. That came just days after Europe's governing body ordered clubs Shakhtar Donetsk and Lazio to close parts of their stadium because of racist behaviour among their fans.
Players are finding new ways to highlight the scale of the problem and call for action. Danny Rose and Raheem Sterling, 2 players who were abused throughout that England match in Montenegro, were among several professionals who joined a 24-hour social media boycott on Friday.
But with reported cases of racism in football on the increase, what more needs to be done? We're joined by Paul Mortimer. He's a former English Premier League footballer who's now active with anti-racism group Show Racism the Red Card. He's in London.
Colin King is author of Offside Racism, Playing the White Man. He is also head coach at the Black and Asian Coaches Association. He joins us from London. Also in London is Piara Power, executive director at Football Against Racism in Europe.
And completing our lineup, Lee Wellings is in London. He's an Al Jazeera sport correspondent who has reported widely on world football. Hello, gents. Good to have you here. Sorry about the subject matter. I want to play this to you because this is a game between Lazio and AC Milan. Paul, I'm just wondering what this does to you when you watch this. Have a look, have a listen. So this banana is for you. Paul, this is 2019. What is going on?
It doesn't surprise me. It's happening so much now that it's almost normalised. You know, the three other gentlemen will tell you that this is something that is being experienced far too often. And for me, I look at it and I just think, you know what? I'm not surprised. In Italy, it is prevalent. They have a huge problem with it. It's not to say that we don't in England, but in Italy they have a huge problem where, you know, Moise Kean was racially abused, and his own teammates and manager claimed that he was partly to blame. He was a victim. He's partly to blame. So if they are saying things like that, I'm not surprised about what the fans say. It's not a surprise to me at all.
Lee, I see you nodding. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what we see, these cases of racism in football grounds, what's happened over the last month or two, I think in a way, there's one element, bizarrely, that might just be a good thing. I think the chaps will know what I mean by that, in that these are high-profile games and people are talking about it. They're having the conversation. We're away from what I'd like to see, and that's proper action from FIFA and UEFA. But these things happen all the time away from high-level football. That's something we need to make the distinction here. This is top leagues. Throughout Europe, we're mainly talking. It happens week in, week out across amateur and grassroots football, where people are having to walk away from the game because of racism. And the fact that someone like, it's brilliant to see Raheem Sterling come out and talk about this particularly, because it means that people are putting a spotlight on what has been there and is still there. It's not that much worse now than it has been for the past few years and the past few decades.
So I'm picked up on what you said, Lee, as I think the line was what has been there and what is still there, because we got this tweet from Naslihan, who tweets the show often, a dedicated stream viewer, and she writes, racism is making a comeback globally, and the world of football isn't any different. It's that idea of making a comeback that I'm hoping you can pick up on, Colin, because you've been in this industry now for a while. Do you think this is something that has gotten worse, or has it always been there, kind of simmering under the surface?
So I didn't quite hear the question, but I think it's always been there, that disease has been there. I think the diagnosis of the disease has changed quite radically from the 70s, where we actually accepted a ritual that took part in football. Morally, it's no longer acceptable, so we're now looking at it from a punitive point of view. But if you look at it deeply, it transfers some of these sort of scientific beliefs about black people that translate from outside society with the rise of the popular right-wing movement within the stadium. And I think we need to take this really quite seriously, given what's happening in postmodern society and football and that relationship. And it needs to be a collective strategic approach to challenging these issues.
Colin, as a young player, you experienced extreme racism that put you off actually wanting to play football, so you moved into more coaching. Can you tell us about that story that made you realise how racist football can be?
Well, unlike Paul, who had that fortune of playing the professional game, there's quite a few black players in the 70s who actually were demonised and abused by white coaches in the structure of the game. I was called the N-word, which I found quite traumatic. I ended up being sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And I think that's a lot of things that those experiences are what I think cause post-traumatic issues that are facing black players now in the game of the structures. I think what's particularly difficult is that you can't locate racism to the fan culture. That's what I call the kind of like overt side of it. There are sort of institutional sides of issues that we need to look at that relationship.
Colin is quite right. I mean, for me as a kid, I experienced racism where I lived. I lived in Shepherd's Bush. I'm a London boy, so I kind of lived around it. There were certain parts I had to navigate my way from school, home, and back again through areas that I knew I couldn't go through because I was a black guy. So when it came to football, was I ready for it? Yeah. Did I experience it? Yeah. But in different ways. There was the overt stuff where it was told to my face, but there were also things like I had physiotherapists, people who who were in positions of authority, telling me things like, well, you don't need to do the swimming today because I know black guys don't like to swim. I had people saying to me, coaches saying to me, you know what, you're not going to be great over the next few months because the weather's getting cold. It was things like that, as well as the overt stuff. It was the subtle stuff where people, because of my characteristics, assumed certain things. I'm angry. I'm always angry, for example. I've had spells where if I've disagreed with someone and they say, well, you're a bit angry. Your lot are a bit angry, aren't you? So, and people start to look at that and identify that with me because of my characteristics. So it's not just the overt stuff that's in your face. It's the subtle stuff that people don't see, that people aren't quite sure about.
Piara, what I find
and one of the reasons that people haven't always seen it is the media, of course, not reporting it. So to come in here, but I mean, I'm guilty of this as much as anybody else in that I, as a young reporter, reported on Charlton and Crystal Palace matches that Paul played in. Nobody spoke about any racism then, I think partly overshadowed by some of the hooliganism that was happening, but people just weren't talking about a race issue, and it was happening. It was happening to players. It was happening quite famously to players like John Barnes. And over decades, these things have still happened and not been talked about. And over the last few weeks particularly, and in English football, and obviously with the England team going to Montenegro as well, but within even the Premier League, there have been these high-profile cases, and there have been what players like Raheem Sterling have said. And of course, the question is this partly to do with the political climate in the country at the moment? Is it to do with the tension around Brexit that actually some of it is filtering into the stadiums? I'm quite interested what the chaps think about that.
I would say yeah. I would definitely say yeah, because I did work for an organisation called Kick It Out recently, and when the referendum decision came out, there was a spike in behaviour where people literally, it was far more overt. They could tell people to go, to leave. Now, the thing about, you're talking about Raheem Sterling and what happened to him at Chelsea, where he walked over to the side of the pitch to pick up the ball and was racially abused. For me, that upset me because 25, 30 years ago, the exact same thing happened to me. I was at a game playing And one of my teammates before the game said to me, listen, there's a certain section of the crowd, okay, if the ball goes out there, do not go there. And, you know, as a young lad, I'm sort of blasé and saying, no, I don't want to hear you. You're talking rubbish. Well, the ball went out there and I went over there, and the abuse I got, the heat of the hatred that I experienced when I saw Raheem Sterling the other day, it was quite upsetting.
Yeah, Paul, let me just play that moment. Let me just play that moment. You're not going to hear what people are saying, but people who were there are saying it was racist abuse. And can you imagine that being your workplace and having to go to work like that? Lee just mentioned a very famous incident, which was John Barnes playing in an FA Cup game, and he was kicking bananas off the pitch. There's a banana there. That was in the 1980s, but let me show you something that was just a little while ago. And again, here, recent game, banana on the pitch. Malika, where do you want to take us next?
Well, Lee, you mentioned the media, and that is actually something that we've heard in our community as well. And so I wanted to share an example of just one of the examples. This is from Raheem Sterling's actual Instagram page, because we mentioned his name a little bit earlier, and he showcases two headlines, really ripped from the headlines. One about himself, young Manchester City footballer, 20, on $25,000 a week, splashes out on a mansion on market for $2.25 million, despite having never started a Premier League match. And then he shares another headline about a similar player who also bought a home for his mother. And the headline is quite different. Manchester City starlet Phil Foden buys new $2 million home for his mom. So you can see the difference there, but it's that idea that is making headlines itself. So this is one from someone we actually got a video comment from. This is from the ESPN's The Undefeated. And here is what the author of this piece told the stream.
Research dating back nearly a century shows a strong link between racist media messages and people's negative attitudes towards people of color. Black athletes in particular are presented as selfish, arrogant, and even beastly. So that's why in arenas across Europe, you see people making monkey noises at the athletes, throwing bananas on the pitch, and even using racial slurs, like in the case of Raheem Sterling with Manchester City. Media companies and media outlets are influential in how people view race and racism, and if British tabloids in particular don't change the way that they present black athletes, that will lead to further harassment of the athletes.
So, Paul, I'll give that one over to you. Do you think that this is something that is being looked at as this needs to change? Oh,
hugely. I mean, you know, and that's the kind of the kind of drip feeding of racist language that I'm talking about. I mean, you know, the way the media represents black and ethnic minority players is, you know, they're unintelligent. It's about their physical abilities, not their mental agility. You know, that's how they're viewed: big and black and strong and can run, and never anything to do with their intelligence. And if they're successful, I look at Paul Pogba, people like that, for example. He's treated this way because he's a successful black man, okay, who actually is just being himself. Now, your Harry Kanes, people like that, they never get the kind of negative press that someone like Paul Pogba. I remember Raheem Sterling, you know, flew on a budget airline, he was too cheap. You know, splashes out on a house, he's too flash. You don't really see white players being represented in that way. And it's not subtle at all. It is very, very
How do you change that? It's so obvious that you would think it would just take an editor to say, hey, we're not going to use this language anymore. Let's stop. Let's move on.
Well, the problem that you have is there's an underrepresentation of black and ethnic minority journalists. You see, there's this program that comes on our local pay-per-view TV supplement thing, where all the journalists, majority of the journalists are white. You know, you have this situation where 4 white men are talking about racism. You know, until there is a proper representation of black and ethnic minority people within the media, within the written and vocal press, nothing will change, because you need to be able to challenge those editors, their understanding of racism. You look at them and you look at possibly how they grew up, the people that they grew up with, how they've been taught to view black and ethnic minority people. Often, they've never seen them in positions of power. In fact, the only probably ownership or power they've seen black and ethnic minority people is the Asian person that owns a corner shop. That's about it. They've not seen people like you or me in positions of authority. So why would they give up some of their power to someone with those characteristics?
Piara, I want to bring you into the conversation here because Paul makes a really good point. It's who are the gatekeepers, who are making the decisions, and how comfortable are they with making decisions? Let me just play you a little clip. This is Gareth Southgate, who is the manager of England's national team, and he's been asked a question about racism. Watch his body language, watch his comfort level.
I think I try to protect my players as much as I possibly can. I'm not the authority on the subject. I'm a middle-aged white guy speaking about racism. It's not something that I really have. I just finding it a really difficult subject to broach because I want my players to enjoy playing football and not be scarred by the experiences. And if people feel I should have done more, then I can only apologise.
Piara, he almost feels like he wants the ground to swallow him up. He doesn't want to talk about racism if he can possibly help it. But talking about the governing bodies, the upper echelons of the sport, how much is that changing? I know that's something that you are working really hard to actually impact, but how much is it changing?
Well, I think, Paul introduced a very interesting idea of power. Who holds power in sport, in football, in the society that we live in? And that is directly related to some of the, the perpetuation of racist ideas. Whether it's an individual, a young guy who's on social media and just throws a racial slur, or whether it's someone who goes to the stadium, buys a bag of bananas to deliberately target people. This is all about their conception of power. Who is powerful, who is not powerful, and how their engagement with that power is being played out. For them, it's through football. And I think the lack of diverse leadership, whether it's in the media newsrooms, the media hierarchies, or whether it's in football governance, or whether it's, the lack of black coaches and managers that we have in this country, it's a very stark issue. And I think it's one of those things that does unquestionably lead to some of the conceptualization that we have of other people in this country. The way in which Paul has just talked very articulately, the way he's seen as a player when he was playing, the way that Colin will tell you, the way he's seen as a coach. All of those things are about power, and they are about the inability of people who are in power at the moment to share that, to recognize that other people have a contribution to make, to recognize that through diversity, we could do things better. And now, going back to addressing this point about Gareth Southgate, I was surprised actually that he felt so uncomfortable. I mean, I think like most people, I took his sort of plea, his sort of mea culpa, if you like, that he didn't do more at face value. But I was surprised. This is somebody who's played with black players since he was a child. He's known many, many black people as a player, probably socially as well. So I was surprised that he still feels so uncomfortable talking about racism, particularly when his players have been abused.
I'm going to defend Gareth Southgate there, if I may, Piara. I'm going to jump in and defend Gareth. I know you're not attacking him. I want to actually make a distinction. I'm very passionately about this. That Gareth Southgate there, I remember that well, and I remember his attitude and demeanour about what was happening with his players. And I think the thing about Gareth Southgate is he's speaking very honestly and openly. You can see the honesty dripping from him, and you can see he's taking on a sense of almost shame about how we deal with these issues. And I think there's a big difference between how Gareth Southgate has dealt with it and what Paul was talking about a moment ago with the kind of programme that has 4 grumpy white male middle-aged journalists who have the cheek to say in that programme in the UK, well, who are we to talk about this? Why are there 4 white men on this programme? Well, guess what? it is you. You are there. So what are you going to do about it? Are you doing anything to change it? Are you trying to actually change a culture of more opportunities for young journalists, to bring more young journalists who happen to be black through? Are you actually doing something to help, or are you making yourself look better on that programme and on social media by actually sort of making yourself look like, I understand?
I entirely agree with you, and I agree with your point on Gareth Southgate. But I do think that the fact that Southgate feels so uncomfortable in that environment after his players have been attacked shows actually that he or the FA haven't really planned a situation like this. This sort of scenario will continue for a long time going forward. The French, the English, some of the Scandinavian teams, perhaps the Portuguese, will face this for a long time to come, because we have the most players of African heritage, the most diverse players playing in these teams. In other countries, there's often a culture clash, there's a particular circumstance sometimes during matches. So the England team will see this in the future. And I think, we are living in 2019. The coach of the national team should by now have been trained how to deal with this, should by now know that this, you're going to face this, and this is the mechanisms that we trigger in order to deal with it in the field of play and then outside as well. That's not to criticise Gareth Southgate. Something has not quite gone right.
Right, and Piara, I think that's interesting what you're saying, because of course it's a higher level, and so on the grassroots, on the ground, what to do about it is what our audience is talking about, the little things that each person can do. So one person who's watching on YouTube, Ivo says, I think football associations should charge hefty fines to the clubs or respective associations that inflict a pain on the club. But another person writes in on Twitter, this is Gustavo, who says, it's common practice in Mexican football matches for the crowd to taunt the opposing goalie. As he or she takes a goal kick to restart the game, the crowd chants a homophobic word. Mexican football has already paid at least 12 fines to FIFA for this, but the chant won't stop. So if this won't stop it, Colin, then what is the answer?
I think it's a difficult question to look at, particularly at grassroots. And I think fines seem to be perceived as a slap on the wrist for clubs that can afford to pay it, so it doesn't really hurt them. And then you want to put bigger fines, then you want to ban them. I think you've got to actually look at what's the relationship between a criminal act in the stadium compared to outside, and why aren't we using some of those punitive criminal justice systems to actually deal with what I call racialized motivated acts and beliefs that are violating black players and reducing them to modern commodities, what I call modern slavery. And I think we should be activating some of those legislation so they're taken much more seriously. I often think that the county structures are predominantly white. They haven't got the level of competency, sensitivity, or understanding of what racism actually is as an experience and as a violation. And we're poorly represented in those disciplinary judgments.
Yeah.
Lots of black people have loads of lack of attitude or investment, because when they report it, it's almost like they've been attacked and violated. And so those structures need to be changed. And one of the things that gets me about this whole system, which a black player can be on the field of play, but they can't walk off. They have to wait for a referee or manager. That is ridiculous.
Colin, can I just tell people, because Colin, we were just in the last minute of this show, so I want to show people what you are actively doing to change the culture of the game. I want to show this from the Black and Asian Coaches Association that you head up here, and you are bringing new coaches into the game from the grassroots level to change the complexion of football across the UK. We did speak to FIFA. They sent us some information here. They talked about introducing an anti-discrimination monitoring system, also about applying harsh sanctions for any such kind of behaviour. FIFA talking about racism there. And then also from UEFA, they're actually talking about bans of at least 10 matches for racist behaviour. Let me just go back to Paul. I started with you, Paul. I want to end with you. In 10 years' time, Paul, we're still going to be talking about racism in the game?
Yes, we are, because as you see, what you have to recognise is this is a society problem. Everyone in the stadium comes out into the community, which makes up society. It's not football's responsibility to cure society's ills.
Right.
But while people are within the stadium, it's football's responsibility to educate them, sanction them. If they need punishing them, but deal with the issue in the best ways possible.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much to Lee and to Piara and also to Colin as well, and for you for taking part in the program. Lika, how's this going down online?
I will end with this from Waiki, who says racism can be fully exonerated from football. It is possible.
Lika and I will see you online at AJ Stream. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.